So in part one, we looked at how innate behaviors are pre-programmed and organisms just kind of do them and come into the world doing them and without much thought. So now we're going to look at another set of behaviors. These are going to be around circadian and circannual rhythms. So first of all, what are these? A circadian rhythm is just the cyclical change that happens in your metabolism over a 24-hour period. So an obvious example of this would be your sleep-wake cycle. Generally in the morning, you wake up and you tend to be alert and active throughout the day, and then at nighttime you start to get tired and then you go to sleep. This circadian rhythm is largely regulated by a hormone called melatonin, which triggers sleep. And you can see at 6 p.m., melatonin levels start to climb up, and that's what kind of starts to trigger sleepiness. Little fun fact about circadian rhythm, you may be aware of this, but artificial light actually can disrupt this. Your melatonin levels are a result of the amount of daylight that you're exposed to. And so artificial light can disrupt that. And a smartphone is a common example of this. And so if you're somebody who likes to sit in bed and stare at a screen before you go to sleep, that is probably altering and affecting your melatonin levels in ways you don't fully understand and could explain why you have a hard time falling asleep later. So keep those phones out of the bedroom, ladies and gentlemen. Another example of this is jet lag. Obviously, if it's 6 p.m. in the United States and it's nighttime, and then you hop a plane and you fly to China, it's not going to be the same time there. It's going to be a totally different time, and so you might your biological clock may say it's day, but the new time zone you're in is saying it's night, and that can be disruptive. And that's why jet lag is a thing. It takes a little while for your melatonin levels to kind of recalibrate to the new cycle. A circannual rhythm is similar, only these are cyclical changes over a period of a year. And again, many of these are not again the first time. These are used to adapt to the changing seasons. So, plants will flower in the spring and then chillax in the summer, go, kill off their leaves, and the leaves change color and drop them in the fall, and then go dormant in the winter. These are circannual changes. So, an example of a behavior related to this is flowering. Some plant species will flower in the spring, others in the fall. And so a good logical question might be, how do plants know when it's time? And then why do they flower at a particular time of year? Why not just flower all the time? Doesn't it seem like that'd be better? Well, at the root of all this is something called photoperiodism, which is a response to the relative lengths of day and night. And this is how organisms, both plants and animals, figure out what time of year it is. And this works because, at least as you move further away from the equator, days tend to get shorter in the winter and longer in the spring. And so there's a way to figure it out. So an example of this in plant flowering, some plants are what we call short day plants, which means they bloom when a day is shorter than a critical length. And so if you look at this figure, the critical length is kind of represented by this dotted line. And for a short day plant, here the amount of daylight represented in yellow is shorter than that critical length. And so boom, this plant will flower then. Short day plants will bloom in late summer or early fall as the days get shorter. So you can imagine the summer you have long days, represented by where my mouse is, and then slowly the days get shorter, 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 shorter until you cross that threshold, and then boom, they're gonna start to flower in the fall. Long day plants, by contrast, irises are an example of this, they bloom when a day is longer than a critical night length. And so here's our critical length, and here the day is longer than a certain period, and so then they'll bloom. If it's shorter, they won't. And so these are going to bloom in spring as the days get longer throughout the year. Interestingly, it is actually the night length that actually matters. And so you can kind of in your head think a short day plant would be a long night plant, meaning it needs a night longer than that critical length. And we know that they're actually responding to night because if we disrupt this cycle, so here we have this nice short day plant blooming, but if we interrupt that with a flash of light, we can actually disrupt that and prevent flowering. And the same thing over here. Here we have a long day plant not flowering, but if we give a little flash of light, then it does flower. And so how would this increase the fitness of these plants? Well, you must remember that resources are not unlimited. And so if you plants that flower in the fall, they tend to lay their seeds. The seeds go dormant over the winter, and then as soon as spring comes, those seeds are in position to grow and take advantage of the added warmth and the added water availability, and then have the maximum amount of time before the next winter to grow and thrive. Um, the long day plants that bloom in the spring, same deal. They bloom right away in the spring. They create their flowers, lay their seeds, and again get going pretty early in the year so that they can flower. So this photoperiodism, this ability to detect the time of year, helps them produce seeds at the optimal time of year for growth. Animals do this too. They also have to respond to changes in season. So examples of this is migration. Migration is simply a seasonal movement of animals from one location to another. Great little overview video that kind of highlights some different migration patterns. I'm sure you've looked up in the air and seen that V of geese flying off. Around November is when we usually see it here in Minnesota. By the way, you ever wonder why one side of the V is longer than the other? Interesting fun fact. One side typically has more geese than the other, so that's why it's longer. Um, the reason for migration is that Earth's resources fluctuate throughout the year. So, here in Minnesota, we see this, right? This is a beautiful place full of life in the summer, and then it's kind of not so much in the winter. And so, the best places to breed may not have enough food later in the year. And so animals are forced to migrate to take advantage of seasonal availability of resources. A great example of this are the humpback whales. Humpback whales feed in the northern waters. That's where their krill is most abundant. So these blue spots is the prime feeding grounds. Unfortunately, their calves are born without a whole lot of blubber, which keeps them warm. And so for the calves to survive, they have to migrate way down here to the equator, and breed in these tropical waters to give birth. And then once the calves are large enough, they migrate back up to take advantage of the feeding area because mom is living on fat when she's down here and can't continue to do that forever. And so these humpback whales literally migrate, halfway across the world every single season because of this tension between the need to feed and the need to have babies. Migration can be brutal. Holy smokes, all three of these videos will blow your mind. They're all really cool. I really encourage you to pause and watch them. And you can see that these animals take great risks to make their migration. There's also another really cool Radiolab podcast about migration. It involves a stork with an arrow poking through its neck that somebody found. And why would there be a stork with an arrow through its neck? By the way, it survived this. And what did that tell us about migration? Oof, tune into Radiolab. Great episode. Okay. Another circadian or circannual rhythm is hibernation. Basically, this is where an organism just is like, forget it, I'm out. And they just slow their metabolic activity way down and just essentially go to sleep. And this is a way to survive the winter cold and food scarcity. Cool little thing about this, even though they're hibernating, they need some warmth. And so hibernating animals have what's called brown fat. And what makes it brown is it's loaded with mitochondria. And interestingly, the inner lining of that mitochondria, that inner membrane, has what's called an uncoupling protein that uncouples the flow of protons, H pluses, with the production of ATP. So the uncoupling protein uncouples this, meaning that protons are pumped against the gradient, and then they could just go right back through without generating ATP. And the result of this is that instead of that energy being used to make ATP, the energy is being given off as heat, and that heat is what allows these hibernating mammals to stay alive. And babies do this too. Little newborn babies have a lot of brown fat. And then final fun fact is bears don't actually hibernate. They enter a different condition called torpor, similar, but it's just not quite as severe. So they do wake periodically during the winter. Don't crawl into a bear den and poke them. good little life tip. And then don't disturb hibernating bats in a cave. And the reason for that is if they're aroused too often during the winter, then that uses energy, and that means that they may not have enough fat to survive the winter. And so cavers, are well aware of this and told, don't disturb bats while they're hibernating. Another circadian rhythm is around mating. Some organisms only breed at certain times of the year. And again, the signals are oftentimes the changing photoperiod that changes melatonin levels, which then triggers these different changes. So here in Minnesota, deer, just the old ordinary deer that are eating your plants in your yard. At a certain time of year, females will enter what's called the estrus cycle, which is the time when they are sexually active and can become pregnant. Sometimes in animals, it's called being in heat. And so you can see from October to about March is the only time of the year that females can become pregnant. Males will also change throughout the season. Testosterone levels climb starting in July and kind of peak here in the fall, which is what we call the rut. And this is where they grow their antlers and they become more aggressive, and they basically are fighting these little battles trying to win over the females, so that they can mate with them. And so then this is also hunting season because these animals are active and out and about and easy to shoot. So this is all seasonal. And again, what would be the evolutionary advantage of only breeding in a particular season? Well, the clue is to look back at this graph, and you can see that by mating roughly here in the fall, that means that most of the calves are born in May and June. And May and June is again when winter is ending, the leaves are coming back, it's warming up, water is coming back in the form of rain. This is the best time of year where the calves have the most amount of time before the next winter to grow and develop and begin to thrive. So again, natural selection has favored this in these organisms. Another type of behavior, so we've done innate behaviors, we've done circadian rhythms. Another type is communication. We've already talked about communication a little bit in the context of finding a mate. So I think we've watched a little video here and there about fireflies sort of flashing their light to attract females. We've talked about bird and frog calls. We watched videos on elephant seals and their signal of aggression there. How peacocks and what are those guys called? I forgot for a moment. Bowerbirds have these different strategies to communicate their fitness to a female. So communication is a really important thing for animals for mating. Another example of communication is finding food. So bees do this elaborate dance that you can watch on this link. Another good one. Definitely check it out. And what happens is they come back, they find food in the form of flowers that are in bloom. And they go back to the hive and they do this figure eight dance. It's called the waggle dance. And they just move in this figure eight pattern. And what's interesting is the angle relative to the vertical. So in this case, it's about a 30-degree angle. That tells them the location of the food relative to the sun. So if the sun is in direction A, 30 degrees over, C is where the food is. The number of waggles they do as they're making that figure eight is proportional to the distance. So when a bee finds food, it comes in, it does this little waggle dance, and that tells all the other bees where the food is, and then they go off and get it. Mind-blowing. Ants use chemicals called pheromones. Lots of animals use pheromones in different ways. We suspect humans do this as well. Pheromones are just chemical signals smelled by others. And so if you were able to capture some or harness and purify some pheromones, you could make a little path and trace it, and the ant will follow that path exactly as you traced it. And so animals do this. They'll find food, and then they'll leave little pheromone chemical trails to tell you where to go. Communication is also used to establish territory. So birds singing, this little northern cardinal will sing to say, this is my territory. Fun little game is I have a cardinal song on my phone, and if I hear one singing in my yard, I'll play the signal on that little soundbite on my phone, and you can see a very angry little male cardinal looking all over the yard trying to figure out where his competitor is. I don't do it too long. That's kind of mean. I've done that to a turkey too. It's kind of fun. So that song is them advertising their territory. Wolves howling Lions fight and communicate about territory. Your dog peeing is kind of a way of saying, hey, this is my territory, my turf. Your cat might rub its face on you, or its butt, or its tail. They have scent glands on there that are rubbing smell on you. And so when they're rubbing you with their face, they're basically marking you as part of their territory. They're saying, you belong to me, human.